Hey everyone, Justin here. I'm one of the youth associates here at Village Church, and we are so glad you're able to join us for week 2 of our series, This or That. If you weren't with us last time, then I want to let you know that we are in a series that is focused on Jesus' teachings found in the Sermon on the Mount. And our goal is that by the end of our time together, we would be able to make a choice about the type of life we are going to live. Because today, we're going to look at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, and what we're going to see is that Jesus does not end this sermon in the way that we would expect, or even in the way most of us would probably want him to end the sermon. Because Jesus does not end his sermon with like a pep talk, or an affirmation, or an encouragement. He ends it with a warning that leads us to make a choice. A choice with some really big implications. And so we have two options in front of us. It's almost like we've come to a fork in the road where we have to make a decision about what we're going to do with the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is looking at each and every one of us and asking, what are you going to do, this or that? I've heard it said before that the Sermon on the Mount is like a manual for life. Think of it like a blueprint or a map or a guideline where Jesus is showing us what it means to flourish and to live the good life. But the thing about a manual is that you actually have to follow it in order for it to work. You actually have to follow the instructions in order for them to be helpful. For example, a home-cooked meal might not taste that good if you don't actually follow the recipe. A board game might not make much sense if you don't read the rule book first. IKEA furniture might not stay standing if you choose to ignore the instructions. A manual is not meant to just be read and ignored. They're actually meant to be followed. And whether you choose to follow or not can have some really big implications. Like a few years ago, I bought a used car, and after only a couple of days of driving it, a light turned on the dashboard. And I'm not really a car guy, so this kind of stressed me out because I have no idea what these lights mean. But you know what I usually do about it? Nothing. I just leave it, and every time I get into my car, I hope it just turns itself off. And I'm like really good at ignoring it. I just hope if I turn a blind eye for long enough, all the lights will just disappear. And it's kind of funny because I know that my car actually came with a manual. And if I would just open it up, the manual would probably tell me exactly what the lights are trying to warn me about. I could better understand the implications because the manual is actually written by the people who designed the car in the first place. So if I need information about the car, it would make sense for me to look at the manual and just do what it says. I wonder how many of us go through life the same way. You know, we have issues and problems, whether mental or physical or emotional or relational, and there's some serious warning signs in our lives telling us that something's not okay, but we just kind of keep ignoring them, hoping that our problems will just disappear on their own. It almost feels like we need a manual to help us figure it all out, something to guide us in the right direction and show us what it means to live the good life. And I think that's what Jesus is doing here with the Sermon on the Mount. It's actually a manual for life. And I love that because the God who created us comes to us in the person of Jesus to guide us and to show us how to flourish. The God who made us is trying to show us how he made us to live. And so I think it makes sense for us to read this manual and for us to follow what it says. And that's where this warning comes in. That's the choice that we all have to make. Will you take the words of Jesus seriously, or will you see them more like a suggestion? Because Jesus comes to the end of his sermon and he wants us all to know that whether we are going to follow his manual for life or are we going to ignore it? Will you follow the Sermon on the Mount or will you just ignore it? And Jesus wants us to understand that this choice will have some big implications on our lives. And so he illustrates these implications by telling us a parable or a story about two builders. But before we jump into the Bible, let's take a few minutes and talk about this idea of choices that have big implications in our lives. So why don't you turn to your small group or the people around you, or if you're watching this online on your own, think about this question and share your thoughts with someone that you trust. What is a choice that you or someone you know had to make that had some big implications? Hey everyone, welcome back. I hope that discussion was helpful for you and that you're starting to see that there are some choices that we make in life that ultimately will have some big implications on our lives. So like I said, we're going to look at how Jesus ends his Sermon on the Mount. So let's read from Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 27. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. and great was the fall of it. So this is a story about two builders who built their houses on different foundations. A foundation is like the bottom part of a house that holds the house in place, so it's really important. And in this story, the two houses are metaphors for two different types of life. One of them is wise, and the other is foolish. The wise person is one who builds his house or builds his life on the foundation of what Jesus teaches. And the foolish person is one who hears these teachings and in response does nothing. So the teachings of Jesus found in the Sermon on the Mount are the foundation that we should aim to build our life upon. But notice that Jesus doesn't just mean like hearing these words, right? Because there are two types of people in this illustration, and they both hear the words of Jesus. Both might read the Bible, both might, listen to sermons, both might, memorize Bible passages or take notes. They both hear and know the teachings of Jesus. So the difference is not between those who hear and don't hear. The difference is found in those who obey and those who don't. Those who practice and those who don't. The ones who do what Jesus says and put his words to practice, and the ones who are the ones who are on a firm foundation, right? So application, obedience, practice, these are the key to this whole thing. You see, Jesus is trying to help us make the connection between belief and our action. Because so often in culture, belief is completely disconnected from our actions, right? We can know and understand and believe something, and yet it never really impacts the way we actually live our day-to-day lives. There's actually a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, and we're going to read this quote right away. It's by this guy named Neil Postman, and he's like a best-selling author, and he kind of describes how in our modern culture, we are constantly being overloaded with new information, and it's actually producing in us what he would call a low information to action ratio. So basically this means that we have access to tons of information through like our phones and TV and the internet, but we aren't actually doing anything about the information, right? It's not really changing anything about the way we live our lives. So we are like receiving a lot of information, but it isn't leading to action. And it's crazy because we might actually agree with this information. We might believe in this information. We might even be passionate about this information, but most of us, and for most of the time, we don't actually do anything about it. So he puts it this way: the tie between information and action has been severed. Information is now a commodity that can be bought and sold or used as a form of entertainment. It is disconnected from its usefulness, and we don't know what to do with it. So the tie between information and action has been severed, and Jesus comes to the end of his Sermon on the Mount, and he will not have it. For Jesus, true belief in his words must lead to action. To be a Christian is not just to agree with his teachings, it's to follow them. Because Jesus understands that information alone does not equal transformation. For him, it's not enough to just know something. We actually have to do something. Because Jesus is not looking for, audience members to observe his words. He's actually looking for participants who are ready to put his words into action. For example, imagine that your mom or dad asked you to go and clean your room. You should probably, do what they say and put those words to action and go clean your room, right? But instead of cleaning your room, imagine you just come back 30 minutes later and you tell your parents that you understood what they asked you to do. Or even better, you memorized what they asked you to do. Go clean your room. Or even better, you and your friends are going to get together every week. And what you're going to do is you're going to study what it means to clean your room, and you're going to sing songs about what it looks like to clean your room, but you never actually put their words into action and go clean your room. Do you think your parents would be satisfied with this? No. None of this is going to fly with them, right? It's all great and everything, but it won't really work. Just go and do what they told you to do. Now, I think we all know better than to think that this would work on our parents, right? When they ask you to do something, you know you should probably just go and do it. But why do we think that this works with Jesus? Don't we do this all the time? Jesus gives us his Sermon on the Mount, and we just kind of ignore him and act like, the whole thing is optional. I think for many of us, we treat the Sermon on the Mount more like the suggestion on the Mount. I think in this passage, Jesus really wants us to understand that Christianity is not just a mental belief system. It's actually a new way of life. A life that is meant to look different compared to those around you. So we have a choice. Will you just hear the words of Jesus, or will you do them? It's either this or that. Either we build our lives on the rock, or we build our lives on the sand. Either we build our lives on the words of Jesus, or we don't. He wants us to make a choice here. And for him, riding the fence or sitting in the middle with one foot in and one foot out is not really an option he gives us. You can't live a double life with Jesus where you follow him when it's convenient and you ignore him when it's not. The words of Jesus are not just for hearing, they're for obedience, because information alone will not lead to transformation, and Jesus is in the business of transforming lives. So we have two types of people in this story, two houses or two types of life. One of them is wise and the other is foolish, but on the outside they might actually look pretty similar. From a distance, you can't really tell the difference. These two people might dress the same, they might have the same friends, they might have the same hobbies or go to the same school or play the same sports. From a distance, they look very similar until the storm reveals what is underneath. That's the moment of truth. Foundations are hidden and only become obvious when the storms come. And do you know what's crazy about this passage? Both houses go through the same thing. Interesting. They both get hit with the same storm. The rain falls on both. The flood comes on both. The wind blows against both houses, but one stands and the other falls. In the Bible, storms represent trials in our lives, times of difficulty and hardship. And it's crazy because this passage shows us that you can follow exactly what Jesus says. You can build your life on his foundation, and the storms will still come. Hardship will still come. Difficulty in life will still come. So you might find yourself asking, well, then what's the point? I mean, when I was growing up, I thought because I was a Christian that I would be blessed with a more comfortable and an easier life, and that I would be exempt from the hard and challenging stuff. And maybe that's where some of you find yourselves. But in this passage, there's no promise that the storms won't come. Regardless of whether you're a Christian or not, the storms in life will come, and some of you might feel like you're in a storm right now. Now, I don't know what it is for you. Maybe it's health challenges, anxiety, depression, family issues, bullying, broken relationships, divorce. And the question for all of us in life is, how will you cope with the difficulty? Denial? Distraction? Blame? Escapism? Self-medication to numb the pain? Or will you cling to Jesus? Because the beautiful promise of this passage that we read is that although following Jesus will not help you avoid the storms in life, it will help you get through the storms. He doesn't promise that he's going to bring you around the storms, but he does promise to be there right by your side, walking you through the storms. And if you hold on to him, if you cling to Jesus, you will come out on the other side and you will still be standing. And the storms will come for all of us, and they will reveal what your life is built on. So what's underneath? What are you building your life on? Is it your appearance? Maybe your popularity, academics, success, your following on social media, other people's opinion and approval of you. Because the storm will reveal what your life is built on. And if it's built on anything other than Jesus, it will fall and crash. That's the warning of this passage. Jesus is saying, follow anyone other than me and your life will eventually begin to crumble. So whose manual for life are you following? Because we're all following someone or something. We're all building our lives right now. This isn't just a future thing that we have to worry about, right? Right now, life might feel really easy. It might feel really comfortable for you. So you might have read the Sermon on the Mount with us as we've been going through this whole thing, and you might read the words of Jesus. You might even hear the warning of Jesus in this passage, and you might walk away feeling like it's just a nice suggestion. So this is how Jesus ends his sermon. Not with a pep talk, not with an affirmation or an encouragement. He ends with a warning that leads us to make a choice. And most of us don't love that he chooses to end this way because he doesn't let us keep our options open. You have to make a choice, this or that. Will you hear my words and ignore them, or will you choose to obey? And I think that's the problem for most of us, right? That word obedience. Obedience. Because we're looking for is not obedience. What we're looking for is a life of abundance. But what if, in this upside down kingdom of God where things seem backwards and inside out, what if obedience and abundance were one and the same? Author Dallas Willard, he puts it this way. The truth about obedience in the kingdom of Jesus is that it really is abundance. Kingdom obedience is kingdom abundance. They are not two separate things. And this is what Jesus has been trying to show us, that in his manual for life, this is the only manual worth following. And he didn't just say these things. He actually modeled them for us. He doesn't just teach us the Sermon on the Mount. He actually lived the Sermon on the Mount. He built his life on the firm foundation, and it was unshakable. He lived a life free from loneliness and fear and anxiety and filled with constant peace and joy. He loved his neighbor as himself, and he was completely free of all anger, all lust, all jealousy. He chose to follow through on what he thought was true. And when the storms of life came after him, he came out on the other side and he was still standing tall. So Jesus is not just warning you about obedience, he's inviting you into the abundant life, the life that he modeled for us. So the choice is yours. Will you hear his words or will you obey? It's this or that. So I hope this series was helpful for you guys, and I hope this gave you guys something to think about. We're actually going to dive deeper into this conversation with our small groups, but if you're someone who is watching this on your own, I would encourage you to think about this and talk to somebody about it, someone who maybe you trust. It's great to be with you guys, and we will see you next time.